tested out and developed the floppy disk controller with very few parts. But I also lucked out and I got to lay out the PC board, which is normally something the designer doesn't do. And as I'm laying out the PC board just as precisely as I designed, trying to have the very minimum number of crossovers, feed-throughs. If you lay the chips out in this order, it saves two feed-throughs, and then if you switch this one chip around, it saves another. And I got through the whole layout with only 3 feed-throughs, and then looking at the circuit, looking at the layout, you have to look at it like a map. It's topological. All of a sudden I realized I could save 1 feed-through if I had simply had this shift register, redesign the whole circuit so it's going from left to right instead of right to left, change a couple of bit orders around there, and I don't get a crossover, but here I save one. And so I relayed it out again. It had to be that perfect.
And you just did it because it was fun, right?
I was up just late at nights. There's certain kinds of hours in your life that just get created largely because you've got some internal motivation, especially if it's something you're very, very proud of. You want it as perfect as possible, and if it's kind of like Hemingway was known for writing very concisely, and he would spend days sometimes just to get one sentence exactly perfect. You know, you can just sort of know there is a more perfect way, and keep seeking it and seeking it and seeking it. And it was that kind of energy that drove a lot of my designs, just a lot of late hours and hours and hours to save. Sometimes I would count a section of code would be 420 bytes, and I would work for a week, day and night, and somehow get it down to 419.
One of the projects I did was I wrote a program called Pronto DOS.
Oh, well, that's great to hear, Tom. You know what? I must remember your name. I used Pronto DOS.
Oh, yeah? Well,
I touched every single product.
I want that on
Well,
tape.
I will tell you, every single product for quite a few years that came out for the Apple II, every single one that I could ever possibly get a hold of, I got a hold of and spent every single night going through the manuals, testing them, running them, using them. And I remember using Pronto DOS, but I can't remember exactly how long or what for.
Yeah. Well, one of the things, of course, you have a reputation of having written Apple DOS, but when I disassembled it to do Pronto DOS, it appeared to me that at least 3 different people had worked on it. What's the truth of the situation?
3 different people worked on it. I wrote the very lowest level routines. I worked very closely with Randy Wigington, who tied little reading and writing and seeking routines together in a routine called read, write, track, sector, which, given a parameter of where to go on the disk and read how much data, it would call the other routines in the right order and cause it to happen. And his routine was very tightly written too. It wasn't as hard a type of code to write. The code I wrote for those little small lower level routines, especially for 16 sector DOS, I don't think I or anyone else could ever do again almost. But Randy's code was very good, but it wasn't, he didn't have to do that. It's when you get down to working with hardware and you're trying to turn signals on and turn them off in a very precise order and keep things at a very low bit count and keep things, you know, fast, doing the impossible. That's what I like to do with my code. And Randy was one level above me, and an outside company wrote the entire DOS above that, and it was very, very loosely written, almost like you would see coming out of a higher level language.
Going back in history, we have the Apple II was out, and then the Apple III came out, and the Apple III had some problems with the chips coming loose and various things the first 6 months. And I've always wondered whether it would have been technically possible back at the time that the Apple III was introduced to bring out a computer more like the Apple IIe, and whether you have any feeling for, well, A, was it technically possible? Perhaps there's things about the IIe that required another year to cook before then, or a year or 2, I forget exactly how long it was. But do you have any feel for that? Or what would have happened if we'd had an Apple IIe instead of an Apple II?
Well, looking back on the, I have a lot of mixed feelings now. But I always felt that the Apple II had a lot of ways to enhance its abilities and bring it up, and have made it much more compatible in that marketplace and a good viable contender based upon its large sales. But then maybe if the company had its hands more on the Apple II than they did, they might have destroyed a lot of the potential that came out of third parties. I think looking back now, I've sort of changed my direction and think an Apple III type of product was the right strategy for Apple, but I think it needed a lot of patience to allow the marketplace to grow, and everything had to be done very well. It had to work well, it had to cost very little, it had to be very expandable, and a lot of these things weren't done. And I think the real biggest problem with the Apple III is it had really not much it could do right away. There wasn't much software, and it was difficult to use, especially compared to the Apple II days where everything was easy. and it was not very open and easy for other people to write applications for, to write drivers for. I just heard this over and over, and there were so many reasons, and it got a bad name that even when they revived it with the Apple III Plus maybe a year later, fixed some of the problems, I think they should have changed the name to Apple IV, because by then Apple III had a name of, you know, missed the mark. And boy, if you sometimes that can happen in the first couple of months of a new product. It can just get established as a hot fad or just a loss and nobody wants it, and it just hangs on. That image hangs on forever, and it was a shame to see the company put all of its resources and efforts. I mean, everyone working at every desk had an Apple III and was trying to do things to make the Apple III go for sales, and the Apple II was just selling itself.
Yes, those were the days. Were you active at Apple while the Apple IIe was being designed?
Oh, actually, it was an interesting story. Walt Brodner was an engineer that we had worked with while he was at Cinertech, trying to get him to design the Apple II on one chip. And we gave up that project to make a real low-cost Apple II, but he came to work for us at Apple, and he loved the Apple II. He thought we should do more expanded Apple IIs, like the Apple IIe. You know, move it into, you know, 80-column world and more memory, and so he sat down and he just designed it on his own time in the lab. And he went to Steve Jobs one day, and Steve Jobs kind of didn't want any Apple II projects be going on, especially any enhanced ones that kind of competed with the Apple III. We didn't want people's minds to cross over. The Apple II was the 40-column home and hobby world. The Apple III in people's minds had to be professional, business, you know, for productivity uses. So we didn't really want that kind of a project as the Apple IIe was, but Walter said that he would design in the ability to add those features to the Apple IIc, which was under development, into his chips at the same time. And so he got to work on his chips, and really he was almost single-handedly did it, the Apple IIe. That was his project. He really made it go. Once it got there, it was kind of obvious the Apple III really hadn't ever taken off, wasn't selling well, and we needed something more in the Apple II, because you got to keep coming out with newer products to keep your sales up. And here was this Apple IIe, pretty far along under development, you know, on a single chip, you know, a couple of chips. So that became the product.
And so that's where the Apple IIe came from, which then carried the company for the next couple of years, at least I understand. I mean,
that's right.
We have, thinking back then, VisiCalc was kind of the software that made the Apple II Plus, and then the Apple II came out, Apple IIe, the Apple IIc, and AppleWorks.
AppleWorks. Well, I get asked very frequently, every year, in several interviews, you know, what's the best program you ever had? And it's always AppleWorks. That was just, it just took such a good step of integration. And some of the other integrated packages I've been impressed by in modern days, but I've just never seen a program that seemed to be that perfect a match to a lifestyle as AppleWorks was.
Yeah, I've always laughed at back about the time the Mac was introduced, the InfoWorlds and all the experts were talking about how the next great wave was going to be integrated software. But the only computer that integrated software ever really was a success on in those days was the Apple II, and of course they never talked about that.
And AppleWorks was not only an integrated package, but as integrated packages go, it was a very good optimization of being so simple to use, to understand, and do things correctly, and not have them go some different way on you. And it was really Mike Markkula that was pushing for this kind of software. He would see his own personal needs all through Apple's history, and he would see what kind of program he would like to do 2 or 3 tasks he's doing today. Modern times, he would redefine a product, and he would start talking to other people who were good implementers. And he talked to Don Williams, who wrote AppleWorks. And Mike was really kind of the guiding direction for it.
If I've got the history right, then the last project that you were involved in at Apple was, there was one called the Apple IIX, which preceded the GS.
That